Hello, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jake Ward. I'm the technology correspondent for NBC News, and it is my great pleasure today to be with Tristan Harris. Normally, he and I would be up together on the stage of the Sidney Goldstein stage in San Francisco, and unfortunately, of course, under these circumstances, we're not allowed to do that. And so I'm going to say some praising things of him, and then you're all welcome to applaud, but we won't hear you, but feel free to do it anyway. So Tristan Harris is sort of best known as the conscience of Silicon Valley. That's what the Atlantic called him in a profile. He sort of went through an arc of moving into the center of sort of Silicon Valley at a time when the whole notion of sort of persuasion had really started to take flight in the industry. And in 2013, he circulated a manifesto that got passed on to 10 people, and then from there to 10 people, about why attention has sort of become the product of the industry, and why that's a problem and how we can sort of reclaim that. He then went on to found a couple of different organizations, Time Well Spent, and then most recently the Center for Humane Technology, which he co-founded and now runs. And so normally I would say, let's please welcome Tristan Harris, and you would come on stage, but we're here together, so we'll just have to start. Thank you for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure to be here, and it was a long walk on stage.
There you go, exactly. So let's start with, let's just sort of start at the beginning of your journey into this topic, right? I mean, you went to Stanford, and as I understand it, was in, the company you were in went on to be the founders of major companies, right? You were, you worked with Mike Krieger from Instagram on a project. You worked with Kevin Systrom, who also founded Instagram, right? All these different people, and you're of the generation that came up into this world and sort of created a lot of the companies that you now spend so much time looking at, analyzing, criticizing. So tell us a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about what was it like at Stanford at that time, and what was the thinking about persuasion and about human attention as we understood it as a product?
Yeah. Once again, thank you for having me, and glad that we're doing this with City Arts and Lectures. So I was at Stanford at the beginning of so much of all of this going down. We were there, so it was my sophomore year that Facebook arrived on our campus. I think Stanford was the third school that Facebook was actually launched on. And, I watched the sort of growth of it, and I watched how many of my friends actually worked there in their first office down in Palo Alto. I knew the culture of the people that made it. And I had a cohort of people around me that were at Stanford that later became founders of some of the companies, including Mike Krieger and Kevin Systrom at Instagram, who are the founders there. And Mike and I actually were part of a lab at Stanford called the Persuasive Technology Lab, with this professor named BJ Fogg, that taught about how would we apply everything we know about the psychology of persuasion to technology. So when you think about that, you think persuasion, what are we talking about? It was everything from clicker training for dogs. So how do you train a dog with click, click, reward, click, click, no reward? You're getting closer, you're getting further away. Clicker reinforcement training, to the psychology of Las Vegas, slot machines, to, social psychology, Robert Cialdini. All of this stuff is known to people in the field. It's basically just the field of marketing, which is the kind of gradual unveiling of the matrix-like code that runs the human experience. What actually is persuasive to us, and why? It's a very big question if you really think about persuasion at a high level. And for me, personally speaking, this linked with my background. As a kid, I was a magician. And so I had this lifelong fascination with how the human mind is hijacked or influenced by things that it doesn't see, that are not immediately apparent, and that while we are capable of putting men on the moon and humans on the moon, and while we are capable of building atomic weapons and building 747s out of nothing, we also have these fairly simple vulnerabilities of how our minds work. And I found it fascinating that there's a huge difference between, no matter how brilliant you are and how many layers of PhDs you have, it doesn't change the fact that the underlying psychological weaknesses or biases or limits of the mind are the same for everyone, which is why if a magician walks up to you, they don't say, now hold on a second, do you have 5 PhDs? Then I can't actually do these tricks with you because you'll know how they work. Notice magicians don't do that. They work on all human minds because it's about this other fact about perception. So knowing that, I was at a lab at this Persuasive Technology Lab, and Mike Krieger and I, the founder of Instagram, actually worked together on a little project called Send the Sunshine, which is about using persuasive technology for good. And maybe we can get into that later. But the main point was I saw over time as I left that lab and went on to start my own startup company in the industry and watched many of my friends do so. I started to get very disenchanted because increasingly it was less and less about actually making things that would make the world better and help people, even though that was all of our original intentions. And Mike and Kevin and I were actually part of these early groups that were envisioning just positive social change we can enact with technology. It was actually a lot of people in that cohort that ended up, being very interested in positive social change. And what ended up happening, though, is that at the end of the day, no matter what you want to do for the world, positive social change or not, you have to start by getting people's attention. And increasingly, this is about in 2010, 11, 12, 13, everyone I knew in the tech industry had kind of gotten caught in this race for who had more clever ways of getting attention. So Path had just come out, Dave Morin had just launched that, and they started notifying you when you looked at someone's photo. So if I looked at your photo, it would send you a notification saying that I even looked at it. And so they were racing in this increasing up-ratcheting of what can I do to kind of dangle bananas in front of your monkey brain to get you to come back to these apps, what we now call the race to the bottom of the brainstem. And unfortunately, that attention economy is literally just the world. That's the collective consciousness of the human psyche. And the problem is that, now these 3 to 5 technology companies kind of run the entire human attention cycle. They're holding the collective consciousness in their hands. And it's led to this unmitigated race for attention has led to addiction, polarization, children's mental health issues, teenage suicide, social comparison, mass narcissism, distraction, polarization, learned helplessness. There's so many different psychological externalities, much like, fossil fuels, extracting that leads to the externalities of climate change. Extracting human attention out of human beings leads to the sign of social climate change that we call human downgrading, which is this sort of collection of effects of shortening attention spans, more addiction, more mental health issues, more social isolation. And never has that been more vivid and apparent for us than with the coronavirus epidemic, because we're all glued to our screens for many more hours a day than we were before. And it's like, well, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so there's so many things I want to ask, but let me start with, let's go back to who you were at that time, because I think now, when I was interviewed for the job I now have at NBC, I remember they were asking me, so you go to New York and you run this gauntlet of people who run the network, and they ask you these various questions about how you would do your job. And one of them was, how will you explain to us, they're basically saying, how will we understand the culture that has produced Facebook and the attention economy and the rest of it? And one of the big questions that they had was, how is it that people who are so smart and so well educated and come up with such good intentions wind up creating these systems that seem to endanger human agency, may even endanger democracy? And so what I'm wondering is, help us understand, I'd just be curious to know, what was your internal landscape going into something like the Persuasion Lab or going into that world, and the landscape that, as you understood it, of other people going into that? I mean, there's having good intentions, but understanding that persuasion is the thing. How does that work? What were you like, do you think, then, when thinking about that stuff?
Yeah, well, I guess I was probably about 22 years old and was just starting my master's degree in human-computer interaction at Stanford under my advisor, Terry Winograd. I think that when you first start learning about persuasion, there's a lot of different ways people can relate to it. I actually think, in marketing and the more perverse and dark sides of it, it attracts people who are interested in power, I think, because you're actually kind of uncovering the code of the human mind. It is a form of power. Now, it's power that people ideally would use for good. Explaining again that this app that Mike Krieger and I worked on called Send the Sunshine was actually about noticing that people have seasonal affective depression disorder. And what if there was an app called Send the Sunshine? This is before the iPhone existed, by the way. So it was a concept app that would know that your zip code and my zip code were both in places that had or my zip code had bad weather for 5 days in a row, and your zip code didn't. And so what if it texted you and said, hey, your friend Tristan has had bad weather. Do you want to send him a photo of the sunshine to cheer him up and let him know you're thinking about you? So you could use persuasion in a way that is, positive. But then the question becomes, well, who's to say what's positive, and how would we know? And what happens when there's so much power that you can persuade anyone of anything? In fact, the final class at the Persuasive Technology Lab was about the future and ethics of persuasive technology. And one of the groups came up with this vision of a future where you would have the perfect persuadable profile of each human being on Earth. So I would know that you, Jacob, are highly persuaded by, let's say, the kind of clothing that the person wears, or whether institutions impress you. So if I say that I went to the Stanford Persuasive Tech Lab, is that more persuasive to you? Or if I said, actually your friend, I went to the same lab as your friend Susan because Susan's very persuasive to you. Each of us are persuaded by invisibly different things: appeals to authority, appeals to friends. And what would happen in a dystopian world where you had a perfect profile of each person, and then that was used for political purposes? And of course, that's exactly what Cambridge Analytica is. And we were discussing this back in 2006, and it's been discussed throughout history in Philip K. Dick's novels and many other places. But I think that people didn't really appraise of how bad it could be, what nefarious purposes it could be used for. And I think inside of products, just developing likes and variable schedule reinforcement, like you pull to refresh and see how many more likes I got. I don't think anybody at the company is actually intended for that to act like a Las Vegas slot machine. But once it did act like a Las Vegas slot machine and it worked, we didn't take it away either. And so I think there's this question of, how do you hold this power once you realize what worked may not have been good for people? And that's where we're at right now.
I know, part of what I find so interesting about how you talk about this stuff, right, is this idea that it's not, that it is a design problem in many ways, and that the technology is part of the problem. The companies are certainly a huge part of the problem, but that there is also a sort of a fundamental set of, there's a human code, a programming that we inherited, were gifted, right, by evolution. And the way other people have described it to me, right, is that it was a great gift in the past. It was great for getting us food and recognizing strangers and snakes and fire. It was great at that stuff, but that today we are mismatched now with that stuff. So I'd just love to hear you sort of summarize. For you, how do you see the sort of common elements of persuadability and, the common, what is the ground in which these seeds so easily grow when you think about the human mind?
Yeah. This really does sum up what the core problem of humanity is, which we always borrow from E.O. Wilson, the famous Harvard sociobiologist, who said that the fundamental problem of humanity is we have this Paleolithic brain with Paleolithic emotions, so ancient emotions. We have medieval institutions, and we have godlike technology. And those three things operate on different clock rates. So our Paleolithic emotions and brains were formed, 200,000 years ago on the savannah. Our medieval institutions came from the 18th century, 17th century with, run on update cycles every 4 or 5 years. You get new people elected and you can pass some laws. And then you have accelerating godlike technology. You have the ability to micro-target something will be persuasive to someone before they know it will be persuasive to them. And you can send that lie across the planet to the exact zip code will reach that exact person without them ever realizing that was the case. So in general, what do we do with a world where our emotions are not well equipped to the problems that we've created? That's what E.O. Wilson is referring to. If you look at climate change, our brains evolved for, you look over there and there's a rustling in the trees and there's, threat to survival, go fix that. But climate change is chronic, long-term, diffuse harm. And by the time you actually looked over in the trees to go find the ruffling in the bushes, it's way too late. So in general, how do our brains deal with the fact that they weren't designed or able or had the capacity to look at exponential curves or see problems until they're too late, which also relates to the coronavirus, that the growth of that did not match our Paleolithic brains. So we really need institutions and good conscious sense making on top of that for us to manage well. We cannot depend on our Paleolithic emotions. The problem then is you realize that technology is the sort of helmet, the sense making helmet that we put on every day, And it's never been more true now that we're all at home staring through our screens to make sense of the world. No one's out there walking around in the world to know how bad is are the streets in India in terms of food production. Like, we don't have journalists walking around. So we're all now making sense using our Paleolithic emotions, using these tech platforms. And if they're not aligned with us and helping us see reality clearly, we're all confused and we're all not seeing reality clearly. And that's exactly where we are today.
Do you feel like there was a moment, an early moment, when you sort of saw, your TED Talk, right, talks about there being a room of 100 people controlling the choices of 1 billion people. Was there a moment when you first saw that apparatus at work at scale and realized, oh no, this is bad, and I've found my calling? I mean, at what point did you first see technology, capitalism, sense-making come together in the way you're talking about?
Yeah, well, I mean, this moment when I created that Google presentation was in 2013, and I was working on the Gmail team, which had close to 1 billion users at the time. So if you just really think about that for a second, I mean, people spend hours a day on Gmail. I mean, a lot of people live there. That's kind of their day. They're in their Gmail for hours while they're working. And it's a kind of a psychological environment. And we were working on the next version of Gmail. How should it look? How should it work? Should it buzz your phone every single time you get an email? Buzz, 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 all of that. And I was personally really struggling with my relationship to email because it's addictive. When the new red, dot comes in or whatever, your eyes look at it. When the screen scrolls down because you've got 3 new emails and the kind of variable reward of it, it really affected me, as it did many people that I know. And I thought, well, if there was any room where people would be working on fixing that, wow, I'm inside the team that's actually designing how that works. People don't think, who are the people behind the screen that made it work this way? Email isn't law. It's not, coming down from God. We can actually make it work any way we want to, just like you can design cities any number of ways in the urban planning. And I, started to get alarmed by the fact that there wasn't a conversation really happening about how to do it differently and better, and really realize that it was our responsibility to make that psychological environment work for people's well-being. And that was coinciding with what I was seeing across the industry, with everyone participating in this kind of race to the bottom of the brainstem, all my friends building these social apps. And I said, enough already. This isn't helping. This isn't working. This is going the wrong direction. And I made this presentation that, as you said, went viral, and Google spread ultimately to about 10,000 people, and became the #1 most read thing at the company that week. Longer story there. And that's kind of what really woke me up. That was in 2013. And then I took it upon myself after that. I was hosted by an executive at Google to think about how do you ethically hold the attention economy? How should Google and other companies think about designing their products to not be disruptive or psychologically manipulative to people? And so I worked on that for 3 years, almost 3 years within Google, before leaving and realizing that we had to change things from a broader public conversation. It wasn't enough. It wasn't moving fast enough, and the issues were getting worse and worse, and we needed to change it.
Why do you think it's, why couldn't it move inside that company or inside a company the way you would have wanted to? I'll give you, so Center for Humane Technology, one of its associates, this guy, Guillaume Chasleau, right, is one of the original designers of the algorithm that recommends you the next thing you're going to watch on YouTube. And he, you've obviously know him well, but he, when I met him, right, was describing trying to go to his bosses and say, hey, you know what? We've created a system that seems to drive people down these crazy holes. I guess he'd sat on a Greyhound to LA once and watched the guy next to him fall down this hole. And he realized, oh my God, that's the hole I had made. And he had this realization and so he goes to his bosses. He goes, in fact, with an alternative algorithm that would recommend something more neutral and fair. And Google describes it one way, he describes it another, but he winds up not working there anymore, right?
That's
there
right.
simply
Yeah.
was not the mechanism internally to make that possible, right? For you, what is it like to be inside that company and try to say to people, oh, you know what we're doing is not quite right. We need to be thinking about it a different way. Why didn't it move the way you wanted to?
Well, the interesting thing is the first response from everybody after it went viral, which again was accidental. I actually sent it to 10 people for feedback, not wanting it to be spread yet. And then later that day, there was like 150 people looking at it. So it spread organically through the company. And the responses I got all around, I mean, I got emails, saying this affects me, this affects my kids. I totally agree. What can we do about this? I got people together for lunch the next week, and we had people from all around the company, from Google X, from Gmail, from Android, talking about what we could do. People were engaged and excited. It was very hard, though, to get momentum to change anything because, I mean, fundamentally, it's not quite like there's this greedy capitalist motive and everybody just says that and they say we have to make money and so screw you, we're not going to go do the thing that you're saying. Everyone was concerned, but there was an inability to get momentum because it did kind of eventually, if you just do the logic, it goes against the fundamental incentives because more attention on the platform equals more money. So if you spend less time on the device, you're just not making companies as much money. And, I think that they would like to have done more, but there needed to be more public pressure. I mean, I'll just say this very honestly. I think if the world was clamoring because they all understood that the tech industry was dependent on their attention and was using it in ways that were harmful, and we were all yelling about it, they would change it, as they're starting to barely do now. But back then, there wasn't the public pressure, which is why I needed to leave and to do it. But I think we should just be blunt about it. The problem is just like in industrial capitalism, where if a whale is worth more dead than alive, and a tree is worth more as lumber than as a tree, in the attention and surveillance capitalism, a human being is worth more if they're distracted, outraged, addicted, polarized, and disinformed than if they're just a human being living their life. Because the things that are better at keeping your attention, no matter what they are the things that are profitable. If everybody's out on camping trips and with their friends and not looking at their phones and just learning languages and playing musical instruments together, that doesn't make the system as much money. And so we can't actually depend on for-profit businesses to do that for us. Now, the problem is if the status quo is so existentially harmful because it destroys shared truth and facts, which I think we should get to, that's where we're in a real bind.
So that's interesting. Sort of just last thing on this, because I think it's such an interesting thing. I was at a dinner once with a bunch of people who were there to talk about behavior change through tech. They all had their own app and startup and wanted to learn. They would share working papers once a week, basically about how to persuade people. And I remember this one night there being this really interesting debate in which people were sort of saying, well, wait, shouldn't there be some sort of limit on this? And there was a person there who is a very sort of famous influence, sort of influencer in that world who made the argument, there are certain people who are more prone to this than others. And he said, by way of example, I don't think anyone in this room would ever become addicted to heroin, even if you did heroin many times. And I remember being so struck by that because I just thought, wow, how can you think that? I mean, first of all, heroin, everyone will get addicted to heroin if you do it enough times. And how can you have that thought? And I think it's so interesting that, like, you are describing, I think very well, right, this sort of, there's a common human framework of persuasion. And yet there are, I think, a category of people, some of them are journalists, some of them are in tech, right, who somehow think, but it doesn't affect me. And I wonder if you think that maybe plays into people's inability to get together, band together and say, oh, there is a common problem here. And you know what? I may be part of that problem and we're going to change things. Like, I'm wondering if there's a cultural aspect to this that you think gets in the way.
Absolutely. I think so much of the work that we've done over the last few years has been to first get people and the public to see that they can be influenced, because I think people view that as an indictment against their sovereign agency. So if I say you're being manipulated, everyone says, no, that's not me. Maybe those other people over there, they got influenced by that Russia stuff, but no, certainly not you or me, Jacob. If we're here talking and you listeners listening to this, clearly we're the smart ones. It's just those, right, those gullible people over there and somewhere else. And the thing about magic that's so important to realize is that magic works on everyone. Again, if I dangle a yellow banana in front of a monkey, you have a million years of evolution that has that banana be appealing to you. Or if you imagine you beam enlightenment down into an ant The ant could get download the consciousness of the entire universe and see how all of it works, but it's still trapped in an ant's body. So when the pheromones come along, its legs just start walking mindlessly because that's what all of its evolutionary impulses have you do. And I think, we just don't see that when you have a supercomputer on the other side of the screen, pointed at your brain, calculating the perfect next move to show you, whether that's the perfect, auto playing video to play from your best friend that you always click on things from that you just didn't know was coming, you're just going to lose that game. You're going to, it's your brain up against the biggest supercomputer in the world and Google and Facebook's supercomputing infrastructure. So we're just going to lose that battle. And that's what we have to realize, is that while we were all looking out for the moment for technology to be overpassing or overwhelming human strengths, our IQ, to develop AI that's smarter than us and take our jobs, we missed the much earlier moment when technology undermines human weaknesses. And that's what magic shows you. Magic is not about outsmarting the person that you're working with. It's about undermining the subtle weaknesses of how their mind works. And we have to recognize that we're all in that boat together. This should be another sort of unifying moment like climate change, where we all depend on the air that we breathe, or like COVID, where we all depend on everyone else being healthy because we're all in the boat together. With this, all of us have this Paleolithic brain. And I think a key thing that culture needs to accept that is that you have to recognize that you're being victimized without saying, I am a victim. There is a danger to saying, I'm just the victim of this thing, and the reason I'm not getting up out of my seat to go take care of my life is that those tech companies are manipulating me into staring at Facebook. Then it falls into this sort of perpetuating cycle where you just get stuck and you can explain it away. And I think a lot of people are right to say, hey, look, if you say I'm a victim, you're just going to fall into that loop. But we have to recognize that there is an asymmetry and there is a victimization of vulnerable people on one side. A simple example for people to make this concrete: if you ever tried to delete your Facebook account, you ever try that? What does it show you?
Yeah, I did it. It took a while.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, if you remember, there's a dialogue it shows you before you do it, and it shows you the photos of some of your top friends. And it says, these 6 friends will miss you. Now, of course, if you think about when it shows you those people, those 6 photos of your friends, is it that they asked those people if they would miss you?
Right.
Or did they actually have a bunch of persuasive designers at Facebook's design team saying, gosh, we really don't want people churning out and stopping using the service. What's the most persuasive thing we could show you at that moment to get you to cancel? We'll actually pick the 6 photos of the 6 friends that we know are the ones that are most likely to keep you here.
Right.
So it's like a cult who, when they don't want you to leave, they say, we're going to disconnect you from all of your friends and family. And a lot of the technology design growth hacking tactics come very, very, very much mirror the techniques of cults that keep people hooked inside of the machine. And that's why, it's kind of like the Matrix. It just doesn't look like what it did in the movie.
Right. So I feel like we have sort of inadvertently wound up describing the problem very well here. And so maybe let's start talking a little bit about what you would imagine might be some solutions, right? We have this attention economy built to drive to the very basest form of who we are. People are powerless to stop it. Victims is not the label we want to put on them, but it's certainly, using a programming that they don't have control over, that none of us do. So what do we do? What do you think, where are you at in your feeling about solutions to this thing?
Well, the first thing to establish on the problem side is that you can't build political momentum if you don't have a common understanding of the problem. And one of the things right now that's been an issue in the tech industry is a cacophony of grievances and scandals being the problem. And if that's the problem, then we don't know where to focus our attention. It's like you're pointing your gun around. You're like, don't know, do I point it at privacy? Do I point it at Cambridge Analytica, or the Russians are stealing our elections? What's the problem? If we can't define it clearly, then we can't build momentum. So the problem is the business model of these major technology companies that force them to be misaligned with humanity. The same thing of treating a whale as being worth more dead than alive. A tree is worth more as lumber than as a tree. If we're worth more when we're distracted, polarized, outraged, disinformed, that just is not sustainable for humanity. And everyone can get behind that. So that's the first thing, is establishing a common problem and making that object. In the long run, we need to change essentially policy. We need to change our common understanding of technology. We need to change how people on the inside of technology companies act, and we need to fund a transition to kind of renewable and humane technology. So we see this kind of like the transition from a fossil fuels based energy economy to a renewable energy economy, because the first generation of all these tech companies, they can't not get your attention. Like, we're going to have an attention economy even if we didn't have tech companies. It's the same problem we have with media. But so we have attention, we have a finite amount of it. There's going to be a race for it, but we need a new set of governance or rules about the rules of engagement for how do we compete for attention. What's on the table as an ethical way to get attention? What's off the table as an unethical way to get attention? And so part of that is in the policy side, and we've been working with certain policymakers to kind of promote what some of that could look like. We have a proposal out that essentially these are the new 21st century public infrastructure, but they've been created by private companies. We can get into that. Policy is important because the companies won't voluntarily do the right thing on their own. There needs to be public pressure. There needs to be children and parents saying, hey, we don't want this happening to our kids. It's ruining their capacity for their future. We need governments saying we need to protect our democracies. And we need people on the inside of companies, which is very important. It takes years to pass legislation, if at all. It's very immediate if you have 2,000 employees at your company say, you know what? I don't want to sign up for this race to the bottom of the brainstem in this business model that I know is destroying democracy. I know is making it impossible to agree on with climate change, that I know is hurting children, that I know is distracting us. If everybody on the inside of the company said that tomorrow, that would change the company's behavior immediately, because they need their employees that's your lifeblood as a tech company. So colleges and universities also have a role to play there too.
Right, I bet. Do you think, so you were saying earlier, right, that we can't call people victims because people don't like that. You can't call people manipulable. Nobody enjoys that. How do we speak to the people doing the manipulating without calling them manipulators, right? What is the language you think you could use? Because I mean, what strikes me so much about how effective you are is that you are accepted in those circles because of your pedigree. I think because of your, you speak this language very well in a way that I think even a journalist talking to the head of a tech company, there's a cultural disconnect. Certainly academics and tech people, when I see them trying to get together to talk about this stuff, it's a nightmare. So how do you articulate to the top people at a place like Google, Apple, Facebook, right? One of these companies, to say you are manipulating people without calling them manipulators. It's like, it's the racism thing, right? Don't call people racist, they hate that, but you have to point out the racism of their behavior, right? How do we talk to people who make these decisions?
Well, you just pointed out one thing, which is, it's like the same thing when you see a psychotherapist and you say, oh man, I'm so anxious. And they teach you to say, it's not that I am anxious, it's that I am experiencing anxiety. So turn it into an object. So instead of identifying with the problem, so I'm not the manipulator, there is manipulation happening. And to get them off the hook a little bit, I don't think anybody intended for any of this to happen. No one went to Instagram saying, gosh, let's ruin a generation of mental health for young children and create a mass narcissism culture where everyone wants to be famous and generate teen suicides. Like, no one wanted that. No one did. Right. It's a mistake, but we have to acknowledge that it comes as a direct consequence of the business model. So we're putting everybody on the same side of the table, looking at this problem together, saying, like, no one wants that. Now, the question is, can you afford the solution? Or can you afford to agree with the truth? There's a famous saying by Upton Sinclair that you cannot get someone to see something that their salary depends on them not seeing. So this was in the days of the meat packing and unethical treatment of animals, or if you ran the National Football League and your scientist came to you and said, gosh, I know we've been doing this sport for, 50 years, but we just did a brain scan and we found out that all of the NFL players essentially have massive brain damage that's causing suicides. And basically our business model is to sell concussions on TV. That's an unaffordable truth. You can't accept that truth. Just like if you run Exxon, you can't afford the truth that your entire business model is to drive a civilizational extinction. I mean, inadvertently through indirect ways. So this is why we need a public movement from the outside. And I think you have to kind of get the ground that you get from each actor. And I think people on the inside of the companies, they come to us all the time. We're a nonprofit in San Francisco. We have a whole team that does mobilization. We hear from people inside the companies who are eager to change things from the inside. There's been many changes as a result of our advocacy and people advocating on the inside. Everybody who has, this is a very small example, but everybody who has the screen time of how much time you spent on the screen and how many times you've checked, and that's built into Android phones and Apple phones, and it goes gray at night and it turns off notifications, all that stuff. A lot of that came from some of this advocacy, but we need to upgrade what was the problem statement. It wasn't just that we're spending too much time on our phones, which is where that time well spent phrase came from. That was never the problem. The problem is essentially runaway extractive capitalism that's treating human beings as a resource and dumping out externalities in the form of a breakdown of truth, a breakdown of democracies, and an inability to work on existential threats like climate change. That's a natural consequences of that business model. But because we're all in that boat together, we're all humans in that boat together, we have to pass the legislation that we need to change the business model, and we have to have the support of the people on the inside saying they're doing that. If you look at what's happening at a company like Amazon, where you have Amazon employees striking and saying that their whole business is, producing a huge emissions footprint, and then that led to Jeff Bezos recently announcing their huge climate plan to get them supposedly meeting the Paris commitments before 2030, and the Paris Accords are due. So we need that kind of internal activism, and that's it's been a full court press from all sides, and there's a lot of different groups who are working on that now.
Do you think that there is a way, one of the appeals of working in tech for people in the heyday of the attention economy is the ability to simply scale an audience, and make so much money in the aggregate, so relatively easily, right, as compared to so many other industries. Do you think that in order to have a responsible form of that same industry, it simply cannot be that lucrative and fun for people who consider that fun? Again, like, maybe you could give us a couple of specific examples. Let's imagine that you got to write legislation and get it passed today. What would you want it to say? And then can you give us some sense of, does that end the fun for people who like to run those kinds of companies? Or can people continue to work in a satisfying way in that industry once you've gotten the Tristan Harris package passed?
We've been joking that what we're asking for legislatively is almost equivalent to the Dodd-Frank level of comprehensive financial reform, because this is about comprehensive technology reform that moves from a systemically extractive and fragility creating attention economy to one that is great and healthy and society affirming. And so I think, here's the thing. It would be way more fun to come to work every day knowing that all of my design decisions come from a place of how could I make things better? Like, imagine a world where LinkedIn says our business model is about improving society, and even governments might even pay them to do that. And LinkedIn moves from being this sort of advertising based, attention engagement thing that's always trying to persuade you to respond to your friends' notifications and endorse them for the skills after they endorse them for your skills, and that whole manipulative game, and say, you know what, LinkedIn could actually unilaterally coordinate mass business drawdown of emissions for climate change, because they are essentially the reputation system for how all businesses are viewed in the public eye. So you know how they show you those progress bars as an example of your profile is 60% complete, and if you just add the languages you speak and where you went to school, it'll be 70% complete, and then you'll feel better about yourself. They could add those. That's a persuasive design technique, by the way, that came from the Persuasive Technology Lab. They could actually add that progress bar to the business page saying, hey, this fashion company is 20% on the way towards its drawdown commitments for 2030 climate goals. And by the way, here's the 3 exact things they would have to do to draw down their climate footprint. And by the way, here's the button for you to message the hand of sustainability at that company, because LinkedIn has the automated search to show you the exact person and who that would be. LinkedIn could actually hold hostage the reputation of all companies in the world, because, by the way, business makes up 71% of total emissions. Sorry, the top 100 companies make up 71% of total climate emissions. And so if you think about, our individual choices create emissions and climate, but it's really the business community. LinkedIn could unilaterally do this. Now, as I'm describing a world where LinkedIn is coordinating the mass drawdown of all emissions for all of planet Earth, Like, how exciting would it be to go to work at LinkedIn now?
Yeah.
I am psyched. Can you believe, can I
Right.
hire the
Right.
best people? Can I get the
Yeah.
best statisticians? Can I get the best data scientists? Is it inspiring as hell to just go to work every day? I can't even
Right.
go home. I'm so excited to go to work. Like,
Right.
that's the world that we're trying to create, is humane and regenerative technology that doesn't treat attention as the goal. It treats the outcome, the social outcome, as the goal. And that includes not just for climate. Again, this includes for social connection, for meaning, for finding work and dealing with inequality, like dealing with our real problems.
And it's interesting because what you're describing, though, is not possible for a startup to get going. You need, it seems to me, and I wonder if you agree with this, you would need legislation to force companies that got to their place of prominence, right? The reason LinkedIn has the power to hold a company's reputation hostage the way you're describing is because they went through the persuasive technologies that you're describing to get to this scale. And only now you'd have to turn them with regulation. You can't, no one's going to sign, no company wants to play with
Exactly.
with
But I'm
this.
sure they would beg us to do that, because boy, would that be a lot more fun than ruining the world every day. So, I mean, imagine, the point, just like your point you're making, it's just like the fossil fuels. We got to celebrate and thank fossil fuels for building the economic prosperity that they gave us. And now we need to get the hell off of them and move to a regenerative, energy economy that doesn't kill us all. And it's the same thing. We kind of bootstrapped these huge, massive, keep in mind, the technology companies are the most profitable corporations in all of human history. Right. They have more money than God. And, we're talking about transitioning that economic prosperity away from being this extractive Frankenstein monster that no one wants to tell their children. You know what I did with my life is I accidentally ruined democracy and made people lonely and distracted and all that stuff. No one wants that. So we're all on the same side of the table. Let's move the business model. And we can, again, thank the kind of fossil attention economy thing for getting us here and move to this new regenerative era. And that would be the most exciting thing that we could possibly do in the tech industry.
So if you have a piece of legislation that then, because it sounds to me like what you're talking about, right, is needing to turn 6, maybe 7 companies, right, toward this new thing. What is it that you do? If it's extractive, right, if attention is an extractive product with all these knock-on effects that we agree are bad, do you tax them on the cost of attention in some way that we haven't thought of before? Do you make it, I don't know, a crime or something to have manipulated somebody in a way that we haven't been able to measure before now? Like, what is it that how do you prod them into making that turn?
Well, first, before we get into that, notice that compared to something like climate change, where you would have to get thousands of companies in hundreds of countries and hundreds of governments to all pass legislation to all move all of that along into a regenerative thing, that's really hard. By comparison, like you said, we're talking about, 7 to 10 major tech companies with about 200 people in decision-making roles at those companies, and probably about 50 legislators in one country and a couple states to kind of make this happen. So we're talking about an incredibly
They all fit
tractable,
in one conference.
They all fit in one conference. You could actually, instead of having the Paris Accords, you could have the San Francisco Accords, and you could get it done in a weekend. Now, we'd love to do that. Now we have to deal with the quarantine issue so we can actually all gather in physical space. But maybe we can do it as a Zoom call. But this is actually just by comparison. Like, we could actually do this. Now, how would you do it? Well, there's different approaches here. I think the big thing is, as fast as possible, we need to move them to a public service orientation, a public interest orientation. If you think of it, that's how it should have been from the first place. If I was a private company and I built a voting machine, I'm like, well, I'm just going to sell another voting machine on the market. And suddenly I just got them installed everywhere in your population and there was no regulation. You'd say that was crazy. Like, it's a voting machine. It's a highly consequential part of the core infrastructure of that society. And it would have to be regulated. Well, you can think of it this way. We've moved from the physical world, the kind of 20th century physical world of buildings and bandwidth, airtime, etc., that was governed by the laws of the 20th century and 20th century institutions. So, for example, the physical TV bandwidth of Saturday morning cartoons is governed by the Children's TV Act, which says you don't do this for Saturday morning. For elections, we govern with election advertising has to be governed in these ways. This is the physical world. When you move up to the digital world, because Facebook gobbles up election advertising, what really happens is you lose all those protections. When YouTube gobbles up Saturday morning cartoons and it runs your children's Saturday morning part of your life in the 21st century virtual infrastructure, you lose all the Saturday morning protections. So what we're talking about is saying, hey, you know what really happened is when the digital ate the physical, when the 21st century ate the 20th century infrastructure, what really happened is that the private interest ate up the public interest. And it didn't keep the public interest protections. And effectively, Facebook, Google, Amazon are running our public interest infrastructure. And it needs to operate. And there's a question. This is kind of a new problem we've never faced before, but we have to figure out, how do we have them both be able to profit and grow, but actually primarily operate for the public interest as 21st century institutions. You can imagine that, people may not like this because it's an uncomfortable position. I mean, I also want to couch this by saying it's not the ideal scenario to have small single entities with concentrated power run huge amounts of a society with that much power concentrated in, Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos. There's huge problems with that. We don't want that. We need to distribute power in the long run, but for the short run, wouldn't we want that power to be, we need that power to be governed for the public interest. And instead of Trump calling up the head of the CDC to say, how bad are the numbers? It's actually interesting. Why you can imagine a future where he'd call up Zuckerberg to say, actually, Facebook has more data on the public infection rates and what we could do to intervene, et cetera, at that level. Instead of talking about food supply chains through the physical world, Amazon, you could call up Jeff Bezos and say, hey, Amazon, you probably know more about the physical supply chains of the entire world. So the 21st century infrastructure really are these tech companies, and we need them to move to the public interest, and that would be the kind of legislation we'd be looking for.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk about this moment, coronavirus, right? I can't decide, I've spent the last few years, right, talking entirely about the dangers of manipulative technology and screens and, all this stuff. We had just finished this big story for the Today Show about the effect it's having on young children.
You're such a Luddite, Jacob. There's no problem with this at all.
I know, man.
You're just one of these alarmists who's just,
let me tell you, I ruin totally. I am just as popular at parties as you are. But then, boom, coronavirus. My kids suddenly are on these freaking things all day. There's no way around it. So I'm just curious what your experience, given the journey you've been on, what's your experience of coronavirus now? I assume it's not making you more optimistic about the present moment.
Well, actually, it's very interesting because I think people are really mixed on this. So if you're running out there saying, technology is misaligned with humanity and with our civilizational survival, that sounds like an extreme statement. But it's sort of like someone saying, before the field of ergonomics, hey, chairs are really bad for backs. But if people only spend 15 minutes a day in a chair, people don't care that much. Now, people were already spending a lot more time in the metaphor's chairs, but suddenly when you spend 10 hours a day in an unergonomic chair, you really notice. So everyone had this sense that screen time was not so good for kids. And it was a few hours a day. But now when you have to just sit the kids in front of the digital babysitter of YouTube, Netflix, and Khan Academy all day long, people start to really care. Is this aligned with my kids' well-being or not? Is this aligned? Does YouTube hire lots of child psychologists in the very basic initial design process when they designed YouTube? No. Does Netflix design their entire experience just with child psychologists thinking, gosh, what would help kids develop since we're essentially the new digital education infrastructure for the world? No. They're gradually sort of adding that stuff back in after the fact because they've backed into this place of running the public infrastructure. But what we need to do, again, is make it clear. I think coronavirus makes it clear that these things are essentially public utility infrastructure because they're unavoidable. And by the way, you don't have to be on one of these services to have it affect your life, because if everybody else is on Facebook and you're not, and they vote based on it, that affects your life. If everybody else is looking at vaccine conspiracy theories and they don't vaccinate your kids because they're on YouTube all day, even though you don't use YouTube, that affects your life. If you were a Rohingya in Myanmar, a minority group, and you were killed because of the ethnic violence created by fake news amplified on Facebook, you didn't have to be on Facebook to be dead. So really, just to dwell this home, this affects everybody, even if you're not on these unavoidable public infrastructure utilities. The goal now is to make them not reactively operate for the public interest, but proactively operate for the public interest.
Great. So I'm going to pivot now to, I have a long list of very smart questions that people have sent us. And so I'm going to just throw a couple at you. Here's one that really jumps out at me. So I am a small-scale designer of alternative plant clothing, currently working with fabrics made from lotus stem. As a person doing almost all the jobs by myself at the moment, how would you suggest I be ethical in terms of spreading the word about my label? How do I make sure I'm not trapping the potential customer's attention while also making my label work? It's nice, right? Because I think we think about everyday people trying to live by what you are describing. Not, this person, I say she, I don't know why I'm assuming it's she, it could be anybody, but, whoever that person is, they're saying, I don't want to play into this, and yet there are all these tools at that person's disposal. So I'm just curious, what's your feeling like? How do you build a business without mining people's attention these days?
Yeah, well, I think what we're looking for is better market design, better matching algorithms. And so, it actually even further makes the point we were just making that if you're a small, medium-sized business, it's even more the case that Facebook is the infrastructure for reaching your customers. And, in a messy attention economy where that's competing with Facebook's own goals and it's competing with the user's own goals for their life, we've always had, by the way, to carefully put a border between residential zones in a city and commercial zones in a city. How do you balance the kind of balance of power between commercial interest and human public interest? And we have parks that sit outside and playgrounds that sit outside. So that's kind of the negotiation that we're in right now. I don't have an easy answer for someone operating in today's attention economy because you kind of have no choice. It's a multipolar trap. If I don't buy all the Facebook ads that my competitors are, they'll just kill me eventually because they're willing to do the less ethical thing and lie about their product and micro-target, even though I don't want to micro-target because that's unethical. The least ethical actor wins. That's the problem with a no rules-based race to the bottom attention economy. Ethics is by definition a constraint. I'm tying my hands behind my back every single time I impose an ethical value saying, I want to do what's good for people. If you have a competitive environment where you have 5 other guys come along who don't tie their hands behind their back, they'll just kill you. It's like being in a wrestling match and one guy just pulls out a knife and just jabs you because he wasn't playing by the rules. So the challenge is, how do we play by better rules that lead to better outcomes in which we're not actually measuring our success in reaching the most number of people, but instead the most lastingly satisfied customers? And how do I find as many lastingly satisfied customers for the thing I'm offering as I can? And now imagine an advertising system in which that person's directly and cleanly reaching just those people that they can help with those products.
Right. It's interesting. It's I think as Americans, we like to imagine that there's the sort of the power of the individual can make this change, but you really are describing a systemic change that if we don't have someone like this well-intentioned clothing retailer, really has no hope to get out in front of this problem.
Yeah, and I think it is a systemic change. Unfortunately, I know that doesn't mean that it feels high agency in our ability to do something right now. We can talk a little bit about that later on a personal level, even though I hate to give smartphone tips and tricks because it's a bit smaller than the conversation we're having.
Right.
But I think it's equivalent to if you think about applying for college before there was ranked choice voting or ranked choice marking for which medical school you wanted to apply to. It was kind of a free-for-all. You got to just apply to all of them, and it's this kind of messy thing versus this cleaner situation where people can express their preferences and colleges can express their preferences, and then there's this algorithm that makes sure more people get more of their needs met more easily because we've collected a bunch of preferences and we're doing a better job of matching among them. I think we need systems more like that, where you're doing attention market design, humane market design, that tries to figure out what are the lasting needs we're trying to meet here, and not just have people kind of in this needy fashion constantly trying to grab attention from everybody, spraying and praying and hoping that it's kind of a numbers game. We don't want to play the numbers game. We want to play a more consciously designed, ethical, humane, attention respecting and mindful version.
Right. Here's another one on this point. I don't think anyone, certainly not in this audience, would disagree either with your core principles or the pillars you routinely champion. But given the complexity of the problem, the staggering size of the challenge, how might we reasonably, equitably, and accurately start to measure your success or impact beyond awareness? Can we expect something comparable to common sense media, a CHT rating that rivals Rotten Tomatoes? Could there be some sort of measurement tool that extends across all platforms?
Yeah, we thought about this quite a lot. I think the typical approaches for fixing markets that lack certain values is you you patch on the sticker or the Band-Aid afterwards. You say, oh, markets work great, but you know what? We forgot about GMOs. So let's put on the GMO sticker and pounce that on everything. So it's like the suitcase, it's just got all the stickers on it. So we need the GMO sticker. We need the, oh, but they treat their workers well sticker. And then we need they treat the environment well sticker. And then and you end up just Band-Aiding and stickering to death and doing the rating thing to death. What we really need is to reform capitalism. And the interesting thing is that that sounds like an impossible challenge, but there's kind of a crisis right now where coronavirus is perturbing and showing all of the problems, all the systemic fragility and precarity that our economic and political logic creates. And I'm not like a socialist. This is just saying there's a fundamental logic to a money on money returns, infinite growth paradigm on a finite planet that structurally creates inequality. Coronavirus spreads in the areas where you have the most inequality. Look at what's happening in Singapore, where it's exactly in the places where they bring in these migrant workers who live in dormitories with 12 people crammed into this small thing. Singapore was doing one of the best jobs with clamping down on the virus. But, coronavirus is like a UV light that shows you all the places where, nope, you had inequality over here, and that's exactly where the virus spikes up and spreads again. So I feel like coronavirus is this big mirror that's holding this moment up to us in a mirror and saying, this is where your society and your system are not working for you. And this is where you're all interdependent, because if you're not playing for everybody, then you're going to lose too. And so this is a moment to reform that. And what's interesting, and I don't know exactly how this will work, but the technology companies are defining the new economic logic for the 21st century. They're in an interesting position to define that logic in a way that makes the necessary reforms to the broken, unfettered capitalism system that we've been living by.
So to that end, here's another question. Almost all of the misinformation is nationally and internationally produced. Given that the Commerce Clause in the U.S. Constitution gives only federal regulatory authority, it seems as though a misinformation authority, at least as politically independent as is the Federal Reserve, must be created. How can that politically be done? Do you think that there is a political appetite to create some sort of independent regulatory agency that looks at the new age of truth, the new age of falsehoods?
This is a very interesting question. So let's look at different approaches that are being dealt with here. So you have one approach, which is Facebook hiring or creating what they call a kind of content Supreme Court. They have a content oversight board that Noah Feldman at Harvard and some others have helped put together, and they're creating kind of their own case law, and here's what decisions we made on these past pieces of misinformation, and they're building up their own like judicial branch for the whole world.
Right.
And
their
of
own
course
nation state.
Their own nation state, and they're more powerful than any country, and probably, well, anyway, and they, and they're also, are they doing that for all languages equally? Or are they kind of doing it for the ones where people, the journalists like you and me, and the media critics, yell the loudest? So they're doing it in English. When you have countries with 22 languages in India, you don't have 22 Supreme Courts for all those different languages doing the same process. And so just like with climate change, the West kind of tries to deal with its own problems, even though it's bad. And then the worst, the countries at the bottom get the worst of it. They have the worst misinformation, the worst, ethnic violence, et cetera, arising from all that. So that's not an approach that's going to scale. Okay, so then you have the approach of, well, let's do it through the government instead of through Facebook. So you actually have the government have a new Federal Reserve-like body. I'd never heard the Federal Reserve one before. It's interesting because that's an attempt where we actually are saying there should be, theoretically, this politically neutral entity that does manage the financial system that would be very tempting to capture politically. And there's mechanisms that I'm not familiar with of how to try to keep that independent. But we're really left with a question of who do you trust? And how do you create a new institution that people would trust? And in general, is creating a new centralized top-down institution the right structure for a new kind of chaotic bottom-up sense-making environment where you simply just have too much stuff arising from the bottom to be able to adjudicate? It's like you're looking through a spectrometer and you're seeing just a finite band. If you're an institution, you can only process a small band of information or a limited bandwidth. Meanwhile, there's a trillion times bigger amount of information bandwidth happening throughout the system. So that's not going to work. I think we need better bottom-up ways of making sense of things that don't reward likes, clicks, or shares. Engagement, I think we're going to look back and call engagement maximizing, meaning things that maximize what got people engaged, clicks, likes, shares, time spent. Anything like that, we're going to look back on as kind of like the putting lead in your water supply. It was basically, we should have a law that puts a moratorium, a finite, just a total ban on engagement-based metrics, because they claim to be neutral that's just like an ultimate democracy, whatever people like or click on the most rises to the top through some democratic process. What that does is it actually puts the finger on the scale where the finger is the human amygdala. And so the fear-based part of the brain ends up creating the entire collective consciousness of 3 billion people while hiding behind the fiction of neutrality. And I think we need to make engagement-based ranking of things illegal. To answer the question specifically, I think looking at a country like Taiwan, the digital minister of Taiwan has put together an amazing set of tools to deal with sense-making processes for governance. So like there's a pothole on that street and I'm claiming that it's pretty bad. Is that true, or is someone else going to say it's true? They have a really interesting way of adjudicating that bottom up, and I recommend people check out the work of Audrey Tang, who's done some fantastic work on that. I think in the US, this would be the perfect time to adopt that kind of online digital governance tools, especially since Congress is, by the way, at home, and this is the perfect time to actually move Congress to online digital systems that do this kind of good bottom-up sense-making.
Do you think, here's one, these are wonderful for me because they just follow one on the other, but here's one that says, is there a market in the future for a universal, verified, and unique digital identity that's essentially our digital driver's license? I'm envisioning a future in which you no longer need usernames and passwords to various digital services, but rather you simply need to log in by validating your identity biometrically. Putting that aside, here's the meat of it, I think. This would bring tremendous efficiency to consumers since you no longer need to track hundreds of logins, and in theory this would eliminate identity theft. Also, social media would in theory become much better and less harsh, as future social media platforms would only allow verified users who have a validated digital identity. So I would just add on to this, one thing I think is interesting about this, right, is that each of these platforms acts in a way as if you have this unique connection to them, but as you have studied so well, they are in fact following you from platform to platform, and your aggregate value across platforms is greater than you are on just one. But is there some way to, do you think, enshrine an identity that you carry with you everywhere? Would that somehow put a dent in this problem?
Yeah, I think the person asking this question is very wisely pointing out that how many of the problems that we see go away if people have some notion of skin in the game with a real identity that it gets traced back to. So if you're the one who posted the, hate-bearing ads or, whatever kind of manipulation, you dove into a Facebook group and manipulated the conversation, and people know that that will come back to you. What we lack is a kind of we have an online lawlessness. We don't have any kind of notion of skin in the game or responsibility. As soon as you enter the online world, you can be anyone. The beauty of that is for countries like in authoritarian and repressive regimes that allows anyone to speak in a way without having an ID. That's really good for those environments. For other environments, we really need to have some notion of accountability, that if you break the law, if you do something harmful, someone has to be able to say, hey, I saw you do that. And so we need better ways of doing that. Now, the technical details of doing this kind of new ID system are difficult and nuanced and challenging. I believe in approaches like that, but you have to be very careful about how you do it, because what always will happen is that a government will say, we don't like this branch of those IDs, that's this ethnic population, and you end up in incredibly dangerous scenarios coming off of that. The real challenge also is that it has to happen at a lower level in the stack. So Russia can still create fake bank accounts as they did, and adopt advertising accounts on Facebook and pretend to be US citizens. Or you can be in Israel and use a VPN going through Russia, going through somewhere else. So you're actually an Israeli pretending to be a Russian manipulator going through the Facebook advertising system, because VPNs let you do it at the IP network stack level of pretending you're someone that you're not. So the real question is, how can you not pretend? How can you not be someone that you're not, right, in some verified way? I'm a fan of people who are looking at these kinds of approaches, and I don't know the technical solution.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? A watermark for individuals does seem, in theory, to solve so many of these problems, but it raises these other ones. One thing it does remind me of, though, is something that you've described in the past, which is just, how do you, how could you somehow create some central sense of how much of your attention has been mined, right? Mm-hmm. And I think about maybe the role of some central database, some central authority, at least saying to you, hey, look, here's how you've been messed with this quarter, this week, this weekend, whatever it is.
We were actually talking with one of the staffers on Capitol Hill about, it sort of exists in one of the the laws that I think Warner proposed, but we used to call it informally the You Are the Product Act. So, the famous phrase that if you're not paying for the product, you are the product. And for any company adopting the business model of advertising and attention-based extraction, that company having that business model would have to pay a cultural tax. The cultural tax is you would have to send a quarterly report to each cow telling them how much they were worth before you milked them, so that they really get that you are worth this much to me and that I am seeing you in those terms. So imagine Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, etc. have to email you once or text you once every 3 months saying this is how much money I'm making off of you compared to other people. And that would also help establish some transparency in what deals with the monopoly problems, which is a longer conversation. But these are zero price monopolies because we get the product for free. However, our value to tech platforms has been going up over time. So in a way, the price has been going up. If you measure the price as a difference between zero, one static is that number, and then how much money they're making on me. Whereas the quality and benefits of the service haven't really improved that much. I mean, that's the sad thing we're talking about here is, why would it be better to do it this way? How inspiring is Facebook when it's basically the same product as it was 7 years ago? It hasn't changed almost at all. We're talking about a world where all those thousands of engineers would go to work trying to help you every day and actually make society better, not just, make the ad system better.
It's certainly nothing makes a tech executive angrier than when a journalist says, hey, what if you had to show people how much you're making off each of them? And that to me is maybe the greatest indication that could be a really effective way of doing this. So that's interesting.
I think we should do it.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, so switching gears here a little bit, here's another question. I think it's a good one. As a social worker and therapist who works with young people and teens, what have you seen that works with this population with regards to decreasing their excessive use and addiction to tech, social media, and screens?
Before answering, I just want to say that I really feel for parents that are dealing with this. I'm not a parent myself, and I only know based on everything we've seen and researched and, how difficult and challenging all of that is. And I don't think that there is an easy answer, unfortunately. We did just put out some small guidelines on our website for coronavirus, dealing in a coronavirus world where kids are on screens more often, ways to have certain conversations with kids. I will say one thing. What we learned from the tobacco sort of, waking up from the tobacco, big tobacco movement is if you tell people something is bad for you, that is not an effective way to get them to change their behavior. If you say, don't do that, that's bad for you, that literally just people actually get more defensive. They get something called reactance. They don't want to accept that message. But if you say, let me show you the exact things that are being done that are having you be a puppet of a puppet master, and let me show you the way that thing you're doing with your finger was chosen upstream 5 steps ago. Because one thing that's universal about human nature is that no one wants to feel manipulated. Everyone wants to know or feel that their choices are genuinely free. And I think that's kind of what this whole project of Humane Technology is about, is kind of reclaiming and trying to cultivate some elusive notion of what is actual sovereignty and freedom. What does it actually mean to think freely and to choose freely? And I think that, because no one wants to be manipulated, having that conversation with kids and showing them something like the 60 Minutes piece we did several years ago, where we walk through these are the techniques that are being used, or check out my name and then the Vox.com design explainer on how the techniques of how they manipulate people. I think that has a really big effect. And otherwise, I just say it's a hard situation out there, and you have to have good alternatives. The answer to addiction is not sobriety; it's human connection. It's feeling deep connection with it sounds like a new age thing, but deep connection with yourself, deep connection with friends and others. And if you have an abundant supply of connection with yourself, others, and nature, you notice that you're not needing that like running away from myself into the phone as much, because you actually feel more filled up on the inside. And I think the question is, how do we reboot that sense of human connection, especially in a world of coronavirus where it's hard to have it? So I think things like phone calls and FaceTime video calls, having an abundant supply of that is really good right now.
That's great. Good. And this is when I would turn to the audience and say, let's all please thank Tristan Harris for his time, and they would all applaud, but I'll just say thank you so much for your time. This has been very, very interesting. And there's a little, I felt a little connection. Obviously, it's not as good as the real thing, but I really appreciate it.
I feel pretty good about a connection right now. No, I think your idea of doubling back on the, showing the cows how much they're worth is another really important one to revisit and get done. So thank you,
Great.
Jacob. It's really been a pleasure. I hope people get a lot of value from it.